All right, I want to thank everyone for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started. First thing I want to do before we start is if you go to nvj.network/team, there are a list of professionals who work around the clock year round to make sure opportunities like today are granted and to really give veterans a much deserved opportunity in the world of journalism. So I want to thank everyone who is on that page. Secondly, I want to thank Secretary Shulkin for making time today. Sir, we really appreciate you being here, answering some questions and fellowshipping with us. I skipped one thing. Karan Lenore Kelly is actually on the call. If you can turn your camera on and just wave. She is now she is both a U.S. Navy and Army veteran, and she is now hosting and producing the Sword and Pen podcast. So make sure you turn in. And then my last thank you. So I want to thank every veteran that is on the phone call. Thank you for your service to our country and the sacrifices you've made. So we're going to move into the webinar now. I'm going to explain the flow of today's events. I've broken up today into 3 sections. The first part is VA 101. We all have an idea of what the VA is, some more than others, but we're going to let Secretary Shulkin really dig into the mission of the VA. The second thing is we're going to do is look into the lens, look through a lens of veterans at the VA, and it's one specific topic we're going to delve into then. And then we're going to end the webinar with some how-tos for journalists. I mean, we do have a former secretary of a federal government department here. So he's dealt with journalists locally and at the network level. So just giving some how-tos from his perspective. And then we're going to take questions at the end. So let me introduce Secretary David Shulkin. Secretary Shulkin has held many titles from CEO, Chairman, Vice Dean, Chief Medical Officer, and the Undersecretary of Health. On February 13th, 2017, Secretary Shulkin gained another title and another prestigious one at that. The United States Senate confirmed him as the 9th Secretary of Veteran Affairs after his nomination by President Trump. That confirmation was voted 100-0. Thank you, Secretary Shulkin, for joining us today. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing good, thanks.
Doing well. Let's get started. The common notion with the VA is that, it pays disabled veterans, it gives disabled veterans health care and some educational benefits as well. But beyond basic notion, can you define the VA's mission from someone who's been at the helm of the VA?
Well, the mission is really just to honor the obligations that the country made to people who have raised their hand to serve the country. And so the definition of sort of what those benefits are and what that mission is comes from Congress, comes from the executive branch, and it's really the agency's duty to carry out those obligations in terms of benefits and services.
All right, thank you, sir. Those obligations and benefits, how does that change with the VA as how the military is strategically used change? So how we change how we strategically use our military, what effects does that have on the VA's mission?
Well, I think the biggest issue is that we have a voluntary military. And so therefore, as opposed to the draft where you feel like, you can have a certain expectation and obligation of the citizenship in a military that recruits from less than 1% of the population, you have to have a military that has a reputation of honoring and taking care of those who have served.
You can ask nicely.
Can you still hear me?
We can still hear you now.
Okay. And I think that understanding that it's important that we have a view of the military and of the VA, that they do honor and respect the commitment and the service that has been given, is very important to that continued ability to be able to recruit in a voluntary workforce. The second thing, of course, the nature of the military conflicts changes the needs and the competencies of the VA, so that in the more recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we saw significant IED use in the field, the VA had to quickly come up to speed with treatments for traumatic brain injury and amputations and other types of injuries that were different than prior conflicts. And of course, the behavioral healthcare consequences of the prolonged, 20-something year war changed the nature of what the VA had to do to develop into a behavioral healthcare organization. And as you know, we lost in combat about 62 or 6,300 servicemen and women during those years in combat. But to the suicide issue, we've lost close to 38,000 since 2001. So you can see the changing needs of an organization like VA and what it has had to adapt to and have to continue to adapt to in order to meet those needs.
All right. For your previous answer, you mentioned, Congress and the executive branch. How does the VA withstand the mission, especially the mission that is combat centered? How do you withstand the mission as you transition elected officials from election to election?
Yeah, it's not so much withstanding the transition of the elected officials. It's actually withstanding the political forces that are put upon the head of the agency, the secretary, as well as other political appointees. If you look back in history, a cabinet member generally has about a 2-year time to execute before they end up leaving. Now, there are occasions that there have been longer tenures, like Dennis McDonough has been there 4 years, which is terrific. But generally, the elected officials tend to stay longer. Senators' terms obviously are 6 years, and we know many senators stay in the Senate for many terms. And same with members of the House. And the executive branch, of course, is 4 years with a potential second term. So I think that the agency, unfortunately, suffers from this political instability where, you always want stability at the head of an organization. You always want a consistency of vision. You want that person developing the trust and confidence of the workforce, as well as the veteran community and the political community. But what you see is in the rapidity of the turnover of political appointees, you see, what I call 51st dates. You essentially have to have people who come back and have to learn the agency, which takes 6 months to a year because it's a big agency, develop the relationships. They then, as I said, usually have about a year of execution before either a president's term is up or their term gets terminated. And so you're seeing a constant shaping of different policies and different views. And the workforce, of course, gets used to that and says, oh, this person's not going to be there that long, so therefore we'll just wait them out.
And we have a little bit of time on this particular topic, so I'm going to ask you an improv question. Is there advice
Sure.
for the secretaries that come down the line with dealing with the issues you said of that constant turnover specific to your position that you held?
Yeah, I think, look, there are lots of things that I've reflected upon this. First of all, I think I would go back to the last commission that was put together by Congress and the White House to take a look at the future of VA and what are some of the big systemic changes that needed to occur. And that was during the Obama administration. And when that report came out, one of the recommendations that was made by the commission, which was a bipartisan commission, was that at least for the VA, that much of the political nature of the way that VA is run should be changed to a more traditional governance structure, something more akin to the way that the post office runs or Amtrak runs, since the VA is a different type of government agency in that it delivers a direct service to veterans. And so at the time in the Obama administration, I was running the Veterans Health Administration as the Undersecretary for Health. And the recommendation for that position, which was a presidential appointee, was to essentially remove it from the presidential appointee spot and give it a 10-year term. And frankly, I was supportive of that recommendation because I knew that in order to make the types of systemic changes that should be happening in the Veterans Health Administration, you needed that consistency of leadership, and the career staff needed to see that one person was going to be there to be sure that that vision was implemented. Unfortunately, the administration turned that recommendation down, and their belief, of course, is that this was important to be a cabinet position reporting to the president. And so, but I think the governance model does need to be taken out of the political context so that the job can be done and hard decisions can be made.
Thank you, sir. All right, everybody, we're going to move on to topic 2, which is looking at the VA through the eyes of veterans. And it's when you type in the VA, 2 out of 5 articles is going to mention the word privatization, and veterans being able to seek healthcare outside the VA, and the VA paying for it. So kind of a 2-part question, Secretary Shulkin. How would you define this change if it happens? And in your opinion, with kind of the mission that you've already outlined, does it fit in with that mission?
Yeah. So I'll just tell you my personal story. I'm a physician. I've run large healthcare systems in the private sector all my career. In fact, I was running a very large health system in northern New Jersey when I got the call in 2014 from President Obama asking me to come and to take over the health administration. And that was a time of crisis. That was a time called the wait time crisis that probably many people on the phone call may remember, where veterans were trying to get care at the VA, and the wait times were so long that the allegation was, at least in Phoenix, Arizona, that many veterans died actually just waiting to get an appointment to get care. And that of course led to the resignation at the time of Secretary Shinseki, and the undersecretary and a lot of other people left the organization because of that crisis. And I remember when I took the job thinking that, look, I may come to VA and find it's so broken and that the system just doesn't work and is not fixable, that I may decide that the best thing to do is to begin to start shutting it down and give vouchers to veterans. Of course, we as the government would pay for that care. But I understood the private sector. I knew how all these private hospitals worked, and I thought I may come to the conclusion it's best for veterans just to get their care in the community. When I got to VA, and I wasn't just simply a political appointee, I was a doctor. I put on my white coat. I went to VAs. I took care of veterans just like any other doctor. I got to understand what this system was about, and I came to the conclusion that sending veterans out into the community was not in their best interest, and that the VA was a pretty extraordinary national resource and was there on behalf of veterans and did many things that just simply could not be accomplished if we shut the VA down and privatized it. On the other hand, I also learned firsthand that the VA alone could not meet the needs and demands that veterans had, and that fixing this wait time crisis, part of it was going to be opening up the choice for veterans to be able to get care in the community when it was not available in the VA, or frankly, when it was better for the veteran to get care in the community. And so I came out with a very clear position that said that we need a hybrid solution. We need to strengthen the VA in what it does best, but we need a strong path towards a veteran getting care in the community when they couldn't get their needs met in the VA. And that, of course, is what I would call a middle ground position, where you're not privatizing the VA, yet you're not saying that the VA can do it alone, that it needs the private sector. And what I learned in Washington, when you have a middle position, when you're in the center, it is very, very hard to have any friends in Washington because, as we know, especially over these last 10 years of Washington politics, the attention gravitates towards the ends of the spectrum. The attention is all taken by the far right or the far left. If you're a center person, a moderate, it's very, very hard to find the place in Washington. But I clearly was a moderate on VA, saying that this hybrid solution of both a strong VA and a path towards the private sector was in the best interest of veterans. I still believe that strongly, but I don't believe that the politics lines up to be able to do what's the right thing for veterans. So we're going to see this argument of should the VA be privatized, should it not be privatized, and a very strong separation between Republicans and Democrats on this vision.
So I want to take what you just said and kind of go back to what you said, the 10-year term for a secretary. Do you feel like that 10-year term gives you some of the benefits of having a moderate secretary if you extend the term?
Yeah, let me just be clear what the Commission on Care recommendation was. It was to give a 10-year term to the Undersecretary for Health, which is the one who runs the VA healthcare system. What that would do is it would pull the vast majority of the services away from the secretary because the undersecretary would now have a board, just like Amtrak has a board and the post office has a board. And therefore, the secretary would lose most of their political control and probably no longer be a cabinet secretary. Just wouldn't be a big enough role to undertake. And that's why the Obama administration rejected that recommendation. It's asking a politician to give up control, which we all know is just a very hard thing to do in Washington. But the idea of a 10-year term with an independent board that the undersecretary report to does remove the person making the decisions from the politics and from the short-term thinking. And it would allow some of these systemic changes to be implemented without political influence to, in my opinion, do some of the things that we need to do for our veterans.
Now, you highlighted something, so we have to take this back to topic 1 before we go to topic 3 in journalism. Can you highlight the differences between an undersecretary and a secretary?
Sure.
Having served both.
The way that the administration works, the way that the agency works, the secretary leads the organization, leads the agency. The secretary, of course, is a member of the president's cabinet and reports directly to the president. The Department of Veteran Affairs has 3 agencies in it. Each one has an undersecretary. The Undersecretary for Health, which I first was before I became secretary. The Undersecretary for Health is the CEO of the healthcare system. The vast majority of VA's funding and activities are in healthcare. The second undersecretary is the Undersecretary for Benefits, and that's the person who leads the delivery of benefits to veterans, which many people on this call are very familiar with. And the third undersecretary is the Undersecretary for Memorial Affairs. That's the cemeteries and making sure that people are buried with dignity and have a place to be buried in one of our national cemeteries if they so choose. Those 3 administrations make up the Department of Veteran Affairs with 3 undersecretaries.
All right. Thank you for that quick lesson. All right. So we're going to move on to topic 3, and this is military veterans and journalists. So, I mean, there's some veterans on here. There's some journalists on the call. Yeah. There are military veterans in journalism. That's why I love the name Secretary Shulkin. It's direct. It's military veterans in journalism. So what advice do you have giving journalists covering the VA, specifically the VA?
Well, I do have to say, I think that the VA has been covered very, very poorly. That there are many, many issues that are of interest not only to veterans, but to our broader American citizenry that they just are not, that are simply just not being covered. And if you take a look at many of our national outlets used to have reporters and journalists dedicated to covering VA. Today, and I'm willing to stand corrected by a more knowledgeable audience who's listening today than maybe me. Today, I believe the only dedicated journalists to veterans and military issues that I know of are coming out of Military Times. But the reporters that I know that used to follow this are, and I'm talking about the major outlets, all have decreased their support for dedicated journalists. That has led to less investigative reporting. That has led to less interest in accountability from the journalists to be able to keep VA on track with the mission. And so, therefore, I think that there's a huge opportunity for people to step into this space and really do a public good and be a force of transparency in an agency that matters a lot to a lot of people and that taxpayers are spending a lot of money on. So I think that a good journalist obviously has the ability to develop a network of people who can give them information. They have the ability to reach out and to ask questions of public officials. They have the ability to do FOIA requests, the Freedom of Information requests to get information. And they have the ability to be able to do good investigative journalism. And I think that there are many stories that aren't being told that, frankly, need to be told.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. I see some hands being raised on the program. We're at 4:22. We ended 5. So I'm going to try to wrap up in 8 minutes. So we actually have a half hour to get everyone's questions in. But right now, Secretary Shulkin is teaching an incredible class on journalism. So I'm going to continue that. You've worked with President Obama, President Biden, and President Trump. So, one of the most coveted jobs for any journalist is probably the White House correspondent. It's probably someone's been the White House. What is your advice to journalists? And I'm sure you consume a lot of proper journalism for journalists who have to cover the White House and the Pentagon when you step into that realm of journalism.
I think that the job at the White House is to obviously the easy part of the job is to be there for the press briefings and to report on that. And if you're lucky, you get to ask a question. But I think that everybody knows that there's a certain pecking order within the White House briefing room of who generally has access. But I think the harder part of the job is what you do outside of those briefings and developing the relationships, developing your information sources, but also being of value to those sources so it's not a one-way relationship. I would often get heads up from reporters on issues that they're hearing. I would, develop some level of confidence that if I talk to a reporter off the record, that they would respect that, and vice versa, that they would come to me with issues and I would not disclose, where I would hear those issues from as well. So I think that, not surprisingly, this is a relationship-based job role, but understanding that in Washington, the old saying that if you want a friend, get a dog, which means that people are there to do a job, not to make friends. And I think that people who forget that, who work in Washington, often do get burned. But it is a mutually important relationship between being a public official, whether you work in the White House or you work in an agency, and the press, because I always viewed my job as secretary as, hey, I was paid for by the American taxpayer, and I had a certain level of accountability and duty to be transparent and duty to be open about how I was making decisions and spending the taxpayers' money and treating our veterans. And so therefore, part of my job very explicitly was to be available to the press and to get the message out and to make sure I was communicating with the American public and the veteran community. And so therefore, it was a very important relationship for me. Now, I ended up finding that the standard of reporting changed dramatically from the way that I had thought that the rules always were, which was really getting good documented sources before publishing. But during my term, with the clickbait revenue model, whoever gets out there first with the most outrageous headlines, generally is succeeding from a revenue point of view. The standard changed where articles were being published just from a single source who was anonymous in the White House or the executive branch. And a lot of the journalistic stories that were out there were really just political weaponry. I mean, people who wanted to see the administration embarrassed or fail or some other objective. So I mean, I grew pretty skeptical of many reporters out there, whether they were really trying to do their job in documenting facts or whether they're just trying to run with the story and get the headline first. But having said that, that still does not take away from the importance of the role of the press and the role of journalists and how a public official has a responsibility to get the real information out there, and you need to work with the journalists to do that.
All right, thank you. My last question was, what responsibilities do you believe journalists have? And you touched on some of them, keeping things
Yeah.
confidential with being off the record, the standard of journalism, and you, just you talk. Is there anything you want to add about the responsibility of journalists?
No, I think along with that comes the willingness to ask the tough questions, the willingness to cover stories that people may not want to hear. I think, if you're sitting on the VA side, it was always frustrating to us that the journalists only wanted to cover the bad stories, but didn't want to cover the really good work that was happening. And so I think to be balanced in the reporting and to, be able to tell the stories of the success of the VA is just as important of telling where it's falling short and, where there needs to be some sunshine put on issues and problems. But it is a very powerful position to be able to tell a story about an agency that has such a awesome responsibility, but also that many, many Americans are interested in.
All right. Thank you, sir. So what we're going to do, Secretary Shulkin, we're going to turn it over to questions. I know people were making comments and having questions in the chat. So let's actually, if you put questions in the chat, raise your hands and we'll do it that. But Wendy, we'll start off with you. Wendy, are you there? You want to unmute and ask?
There we are. Hello?
Hi.
Hi there. Okay, I had two quick questions and thank you. I've been covering and working with the VA as a reporter for more than 20 years now. And when I did a story on PTSD, as we were calling it then, in older vets, which I still have not seen this story done since, I got people calling the office, crying, thanking me. So if you want to do it again, give a yell. But anyway, two quick questions. One is on the health side, is the VA doing or at least considering offering vets alternative and or complementary therapies in their healthcare, like using acidophilus for if you've got some infection or maybe smoking cannabis or whatever. So that's my first question.
In general, I think the VA has been too conservative in looking at alternative therapies like what you're suggesting. In particular, in the PTSD field, the evidence-based researchers at VA, the National Office of PTSD, has said that there are 3 evidence-based treatments: cognitive behavioral therapy, rapid eye movement, and prolonged exposure therapy. And those are the 3 that they support. And the alternative suggestions for treatment of PTSD have had a hard time penetrating the VA. Now, Congress has stepped in this case and has tried to get the VA to open up the aperture and study and offer through very limited sort of evaluations other types of therapies like hyperbaric therapy. Cannabis, of course, is a challenge because it still has a federal prohibition. But earlier, VA was not even willing to talk to veterans, even in allowing their clinicians to talk about that as an option in states where cannabis was legalized, medical marijuana. Now, again, Congress stepped in and said that VA clinicians can talk to their patients. They can't prescribe it, but they can talk to their patients about it. So I think that this is an area that I wish that VA would be a little bit more proactive and be that innovator of new solutions. And, I think if you were listening to the VA experts on this, they would say, look, there's a lot of ideas out there that may cause harm that we don't know if they're safe. So by us being rigid, we're protecting our veterans and we're making sure that they're not being exposed to dangerous things. But again, I tend to be, you're going to hear this repeated, a little bit more in that middle position, which is saying, hey, I appreciate the need to follow evidence-based medicine and to protect veterans. But listen, this is an area that we need to find new solutions. And there are ideas out there and things being tested and evidence that may not have gone through clinical trials and FDA approval that frankly have a low safety risk profile, like hyperbaric medicine. Some would say cannabis as well, where it may be helping some of our veterans who aren't responding to traditional treatment. So I think that you've picked up on an important area that still needs some further evolution in the way that we handle this at VA.
Okay, and the other quick question, and it can affect a lot of people. I am the wife of a vet, so I'm blessed
Yes.
to be in places like this. Hubby, we're in Baltimore. The Baltimore VA actually did one of these outside services for him. They sent him to a major medical center for
Yep.
test. We keep getting the bloody bill for it, and he's told them to send it back to the VA. So there's a whole billing story I could be doing, because I'll bet money I am not the only one facing this. So how do we know who to contact? Because he's called the VA, he's called his primary, he's called, I don't even remember the list Richie has. So how does someone know how not to go through this? I think it's close to a year now.
Yeah. I always hesitate to comment on any particular situation without knowing the facts. I assume that the VA sent you to this medical center through what's called the Community Care Network.
That's
The
it.
the Community Care Network in Baltimore is operated by Optum Serve, and the Optum network should be the one that should make sure that that provider is paid and that you're not getting the balance bill. So I think that there are people that should make sure that this isn't happening, and obviously it should not be happening. I don't think you're the only ones that this is happening to. And look, that's a good example of a story that may need to be told because that system's not working.
Okay, so do I call your undersecretary, or is there someone else I would call for billing questions if I'm doing an
Yeah,
interview?
I would try to reach out to Optum Serve.
Okay, thank you,
Yeah,
kind sir.
sure.
All right, thank you, Wendy. Our order is Timothy, Karan, Michael, and Todd. So Timothy, you're up. Timothy. Oh, there you go.
I'm here. Thank you for taking my question. Uh, do you have any idea of what emphasis is going to be put on homeless veterans coming into the new administration, and what can we do, um, especially with MVJ, to get the public or to keep the story going about
And,
for
and
homeless veterans.
yeah, and Timothy, what was the MHA? What's that stand for? Military Health?
MVJ, Military Veterans in Journalism, sir.
Merle, no, okay, thank you, thank you. I struggle with acronyms. One of the rules I had as secretary is no one was allowed to use acronyms around me. I keep forgetting I'm not secretary anymore. But anyway, homelessness in veterans is a long journey started again by President Obama's declaration during his first term that he wanted to end veteran homelessness. We've not gotten anywhere near that in 14 years later, let's say. But fortunately, this is an issue that is not partisan, that both Republicans and Democrats agree upon, that we need to continue to stick with the solutions and the funding to be able to end veteran homelessness. You saw actually this week a new bill just passed the House with 309 to 9, which is pretty amazing when you get that type of bipartisan support, called the Dole Act, the Elizabeth Dole Act, that actually had new resources and authorities for veteran homelessness. So I think you're going to continue to see the administration work at that, implement new ideas and solutions, and there'll continue to be support. This is just not an easy solution. In fact, there are many people that view veteran homelessness more as a medical issue than a homelessness issue, that there's a reason why people are homeless, and it has to do with many behavioral health issues, substance abuse issues, et cetera, and that it needs to be much more integrated into the approaches towards homelessness. So hopefully new ideas and new thoughts. But look, we have seen progress. We've probably cut, since President Obama made that proclamation 14 years ago, we've probably seen the rate of veteran homelessness cut in half. Unfortunately, as everybody knows, this is a recurring problem. As people get housed, more people become unhoused. So we still have a ways to go.
Do you so I'm in New York City. I came from Phoenix. You're familiar with Phoenix with the homeless there. I was with um Manor House as a resident, and I was
Sure.
also front desk clerk.
Yes.
What I'm seeing is a lack of that type of program here in New York City. In fact, it's a shelter.
Yeah.
And Joe Bello, who's on here, knows that. What can we do to convince the VA here in New York City that they are heading towards exactly what happened to Phoenix in 2014, where veterans are dying because of their lack of addressing a situation right in front of them? And I was in Phoenix too, and when Daniel Summers killed himself, and
Sure.
Mr. Summers came up, and that whole thing broke. I'm watching that same situation happen here in New York City. So what can we do to put a stop to that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, oops, are you still there?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. For some reason, I just lost my picture. Okay. But first of all, I know the Summers family very well, and they were instrumental to helping me understand this from a family perspective. So, and they remain obviously very involved in this area. New York City, where again I know it well. I used to run one of the largest health systems in New York City, and that's where I would put on my white coat and take care of veterans in the Manhattan VA. I understand the geography and the politics of New York City pretty well. New York City has its own commissioner on Veterans Affairs. And, that department reporting into the mayor is very involved and committed with working with the VA on local solutions. So I would start there by talking to the commissioner of the city that runs Veteran Affairs and get their support for ideas, and then jointly work with the federal and even the state VA. The state has their own Secretary of VA as well. So I think getting local and statewide efforts to coordinate to help the federal government make the right decisions is always a good thing.
Thank you, sir. Much appreciated.
Hello, I'm Karan Kelly, and you mentioned something earlier. You spoke about being a good journalist, and I want to ask you, what is a good journalist, especially with this incoming administration publicly seeing journalists as the enemy, as we lose our jobs? The threat is not AI, it's misinformation and disinformation, and the demonization of the press. So in that context, what is a good journalist?
All I can think of when you say that is, what Michelle Obama said, when they go low, we go high. I think you have to maintain your journalistic integrity. And while, there is a natural reaction to say, I'm going to expose and show bad people doing things, I think you have to be double down on making sure that what you report on is factually correct, that your sources are actually good sources, that you're not playing into the political wars that I saw happen in the past Trump administration. Obviously, I think that there are lots of things that people can be appropriately critical of, but I think, in my view, many journalists lost their integrity because they believed so much the bad things were happening. They were so anxious to report that there were a lot of unintended consequences to their bad reporting, misinformation. And so therefore, I think you just have to stand your ground, tell the stories that need to be told, but make sure that you're doing it from a factual point of view, and that your standards don't go low.
Thank you, sir.
And Secretary Shulkin, that is our Sword and Pen podcast host and producer, Karan Kelly. She was a great friend of mine, so I wanted to highlight her.
Sure.
All right. Thank you, Karan. We're moving on to Michael. Michael, you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
You're welcome, sir.
Mr. Shulkin, Michael A. Brown here. I'm a U.S. Army veteran. I produce Boots on the Air for and about veterans on KOOP radio here in Austin. In the new Congress, sir, the House Veterans Affairs Committee stays mostly the same, but the Senate Vets Committee switches party leadership. What changes do you foresee and how those committees deal with the VA's present and potential initiatives? I'll take my answer on the air, please.
Well, I think it's almost certain that the new leadership of the Senate will be Senator Moran, who has a lot of experience on the Veterans Affairs Committee and a very knowledgeable person and knowledgeable staff in this area. And Senator Moran has demonstrated the willingness to work in a bipartisan way. Senator Tester, who was the previous chair, and I think a big loss for the veteran community not being there, was able to work with Senator Moran on a lot of issues. Senator Moran has a different perspective than Senator Tester in that he is likely more to lean towards greater access to private sector healthcare than maybe Senator Tester did. But I think that he will be fair in his approach towards allowing that bipartisanship to continue on the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. I don't think he wants to see this become a railroaded type of committee, and understands that veterans issues should be with support from both Democrats and Republicans.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you, Michael. And our last question for this afternoon, Todd. How are you doing today, Todd?
I'm very good, thank you, and thank you for taking my question, Secretary. I'm curious your thoughts on Project 2025's proposed reduction of disability benefits overall, and then termination of benefits for particular disabilities, including those related to PTSD and military sexual trauma. And I was wondering if you could prognosticate, I suppose, what the consequences of this might be, particularly the public health consequences.
Yeah. So, you know, I can't say that I've paid line item attention to Project 2025. The author of Project 2025, a guy named Brooks Tucker, worked for me in the VA as a political appointee. He's got a lot of experience in working in the VA, but I think what we've seen is his personal opinions and views of what he would do if he were in charge. I don't think his views are going to be quite as relevant as the views of the nominee, Doug Collins, coming in. And, I think that that's the purpose of the confirmation process, for us to understand whether those ideas are the ideas that the incoming secretary is also going to hold. Now, I do believe that our benefits design and our benefits part of VA need to be revised, and for much of the bureaucracy and difficulty that veterans have accessing benefits, that they will that they do need to be refined considerably to make the system work better. I also, I think that this is an area that is going to be challenging to do. So I think healthy debate with ideas on different sides is a good thing to have. And I think that if, Project 2025 ideas want to be thrown into the mix, we can take a look at it. But I do not believe that those are ideas that should be adopted as a policy position at this point. I think that they'd be very disruptive.
Thank you.
All right. Well, it seems like we have no more questions. So 13 minutes left. Anybody have any more questions? And Secretary Shulkin, thank you for your time this afternoon. I really appreciated that class in journalism as well. I learned a lot, especially with the VA 101. So I just want to thank you. We have a hand.
Hi, it's me again. So with some of this administration that are being put in positions to influence what happens with our military life and does not acknowledge the service of women, how do you see us moving forward and continuing to serve women who've served? We've had a hard enough time to go all of these years, not even having healthcare full healthcare until President Obama came into office. And to think that our service will be disconnected from the entity that's supposed to protect us, how do you see us moving forward?
Well, look, it was interesting before the nominations came out. Veterans Day weekend, I was obviously spending a lot of time with veterans, and the Saturday before Veterans Day, I got to meet a handful of women that had made it through our special forces training. And I was saying, wow, how proud am I that these women are as good, if not better, than our men who are out there, and how hard they fought to get to the position. And, they broke the ceiling open. And then, of course, we've seen the comments from the secretary nominee that women should not be in combat positions. I think let's just remember that it is different to be a TV host than it is to be a cabinet secretary of the largest government agency, anywhere. And that I think that it's going to be a different standard. And I hope that if Pete Hegseth is confirmed, that he grows into that job and understands that sometimes doing the right thing for the country means changing your opinions on what you've expressed, because I firmly believe having women fully participate in our military is the right thing for the defense of the United States. And, the way that you build a cohesive fighting force and a voluntary military. So the confirmation process, I think, is going to allow us to understand better whether his opinions change, whether his opinions are more informed. But, you know, each senator is going to be able to make a vote on whether they feel like he's the right one to lead the organization. And if he does, what a good leader does. I know when I got into office, I learned a lot. I listened to my people. I changed my opinions as I learned more. And I believe that a good secretary will learn to understand that organization better. And you know, although he's a veteran himself, he hasn't had the chance to be responsible and to have to lead an agency of 3 million people. And so I expect that we're going to see a lot of opinions change. And I hope this would be one of those opinions that would change.
Do you believe that someone who's held that belief for so long that women should not serve, especially serve in combat, has the capacity to change?
All I can say is I think we're going to find that out. And you know, I don't know what's in his heart, and I don't know how open he is to learning about this. But you know, I would certainly hope that anybody has the capability to be able to change their mind given the evidence that's put before them.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
All right. Secretary Shulkin, thank you for the
Thank
answers.
you.
We appreciate you. I'll give you a round of applause. Hopefully
Thanks
you can hear it in
thanks
my,
for what all of you do. It's important work. So thank you very much.
all right. And once again, we want to end this meeting thanking our veterans on the phone call for everything you've done for our country. So